So let's give a hand over to Ghost Inspector for sponsoring us and.
All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, big thank you to the group for having this event. A big thank you to Handsome for lending us this awesome space. My name's Justin. I work for a company called Ghost Inspector. Got a few of us here in Austin. We're doing an offsite this week, and we found this group, and so we were like, why don't we present? So the topic we're going to talk about tonight is headless browsers and testing at scale. Just a little bit more about me to add some context. So Ghost Inspector is a company I founded. It's a browser testing service, and it's really aimed at giving you kind of a cohesive tool for building and managing and running your tests in the cloud. And so it tries to take some of the pain out of that process. We're about 4.5 years old, which is relatively old in this space. And when we started, we were headless from the start, which 4.5 years ago, I'll explain what headless means in a minute, but it really meant like PhantomDAIS as a service, basically, back then. We were also parallel from the start. So we always had this idea of you're building tests and they're all running in parallel. If you have 30 tests, there's no reason to run them sequentially. And at this point, we're running about 250,000 tests a day, browser tests. So we're running at a pretty large scale. Lastly, I've always been pretty active in technical support, which is sometimes painful, but it's given me this awesome opportunity to see how literally thousands of companies design their tests and run their tests and the issues that they have. So I've tried to distill some of that knowledge and put it into these slides. I'm going to kind of break this into 3 sections. So I'll talk about headless browsers. I'll talk about testing at scale. What I really mean by testing at scale is testing in parallel. And then I'll give you guys a little bit of a demo of Ghost Inspector, mainly to illustrate some of these points and illustrate this testing at scale and in parallel topic. So headless browsers. Before we talk about headless browser testing, let's talk about traditional browser testing. If you test locally, you're used to maybe a screen like this, where you've got a script, a test, and you run it, and a full-on Chrome window launches in front of you and starts stepping through this test. So I have a quick example here I'll show. This is a simple test I've written using a newer library called Puppeteer. So I pass it some options, viewport, where Google Chrome is. This test is going to open Google, type in hello, and take a screenshot. So when I run this test, this is usually what happens, right? You get a browser window that pops up, and your automation kicks off and starts to walk through. It'll type hello. This is kind of a disruptive process, though. If you're an engineer or you're a tester, this isn't really something you necessarily want to sit through, especially if you're automating this and your point is just make sure this works and move on. So it's always been a pretty heavy process. You can do this in the cloud. Of course, there's like Sauce Labs and Browser Stack that are essentially services that will give you a VM. And they'll give you a browser of your choice running, right? But that's pretty costly. And they usually charge as you scale up. The more VMs you need at the same time, the more that's going to cost you. So when you're getting into 20, 30 tests at a time, you're talking like thousands of dollars a month. So when you take this away from your local desktop and you use a service, it would become really expensive. This was enough of a problem for developers and testers that people were like, why do we really need this whole window to pop up? Why can't it just be done in the background? And so somebody invented a browser that doesn't need to run with a display. It's just a command line binary that runs. And that was PhantomDAIS. So what somebody did was they took the WebKit engine, which was the engine I think it's still used by Safari. Chrome is now using Blink, which is kind of split off from this, but they packaged it up and they gave it an API. So you could do a test like I just had, and it would run this browser and walk through the steps, but there was no window. So you could run 10 of these things on your desktop, you would see nothing, and you could just get the results and not have to worry about it stealing your focus and disrupting you. PhantomDAIS gained enough traction that some of the other browsers started to come along and realize that this was useful. There were enough engineers like building this into their build process and their test process that the pressure built in these browsers added it themselves. So Chrome and Firefox have this headless ability at this point. It's been there for a year or two, and it's really simple to use. So I'll walk through it in a sec. More browsers in the future, maybe. Microsoft Edge just announced that they would be using Chromium. Does that mean it'll inherit like headless? I don't know. Windows is a little bit different. Safari, like who knows with Safari? Opera, does anybody care? I don't know. I haven't checked.
And these are just desktop browsers that we're speaking to so far, right?
So far, yeah. Although Chrome does give you some options to run in that mobile emulation mode, but I'm not aware of any of this ability on a mobile device. So I'll show you a legit example. Like you probably wouldn't run Chrome this way. You'd use an automation tool to launch it, but it's as simple as this. It's really just this headless option. It looks the same in Chrome and Firefox. In some cases, you need to disable a few other flags like GPU stuff. But it's really as simple as just a parameter when you launch the browsers. So here's another example. I've got basically the same test I showed before, except this time I've got this headless flag set to true. I've given the screenshot a different name. So now when I run this, you'll see it's launching Chrome and it's running it, but there's no window, there's nothing on my screen. It's all happening in the background. And it's finished. But it's all there. So these screenshots I've taken, here's a traditional screenshot I was taken at the end. Here's a headless screenshot that was taken at the end. So the same things are happening, but it's not running and launching a whole window on your desktop. What are the advantages to doing this? The first is that it's a lot more lightweight. It's a lot more performant. You're not pushing 30 frames a second to the display. So these tests can run a little more quickly. No display requirement, so you don't need a desktop. You can run these, on an EC2 instance. Previously, like something you could do with traditional browsers in Linux is create a virtual display. So X virtual frame buffer, XVFB, is kind of like a display, but it's like mimicked in memory. And so you would launch a browser and you'd pipe it to this fake display. And you could kind of get around this display requirement, but it was really clunky and kind of a pain to set up. And so that whole requirement's gone. You can run this like right off the bat in a terminal. So command line interface, you can run this in containers. There's tons of Docker stuff out there that have the browsers installed that are set up to do this. Like much easier CI integration. So if you're using something like Circle CI or any of these products out there, it's really easy to have your tests run right in that container, a number of tests at a time, and you don't have that requirement of going out to a third-party service and being handed full-on virtual machines to run your browsers. And it's cheaper for that reason too. So disadvantages, not quite a disadvantage, but a reality is that not all browsers support this yet. They may not ever. But you can at least leverage this option for the browsers that do. So if you're testing in Chrome and Firefox, you can really easily drop this flag in there and potentially save a lot in resources for booting up VMs. Initially, when these launched, we noticed some rendering quirks. So for instance, like Firefox, radio buttons weren't showing up when you took screenshots. Most of those are resolved. There's a couple of edge casey things. Sometimes I think like initially Headless Chrome couldn't deal with unsigned SSL certificates. Sometimes these like other flags would kind of get changed when you used headless mode. But you can get around most of them. It kind of depends on what library you're using too. But for the most part, it's going to work in like 99.9% of your situations. It is not ideal for manual inspection though, right? Like if you want that browser, you want to stop your test, you want to poke around. This isn't really ideal for that. This is meant as like do this run through, does it work, yes or no? And then if you need to inspect, then you're going to go back and potentially run this in a normal mode or just walk through the test manually or whatever your debugging process is. Automation APIs and tools, all the same stuff basically works since it's just an option for the browser. WebDriver Selenium, you're just specifying this as like a capability when you launch it. Puppeteer, I mentioned, is a package that Google launched pretty recently. Really nice and leverages a lot of these features. Slimer.js is another one that's been around for a while. It's kind of old at this point, but you can use headless in that. It actually uses the PhantomDAIS API, so it's a little bit different. And then tons of other stuff. Tons of packages. There are services like us. We're kind of codeless and managed, so this option is a little bit abstracted when you use our service. But for the most part, if you're using something, you can probably enable this ability pretty easily. Just kind of like a slight detour here on choosing automation tools. Something to keep in mind if this is something you're not doing yet, or it's not working so well, or you're thinking about making changes. Browser automation is hard, and there are always trade-offs in these different packages that you choose. So, you know, the front runner, or like one of the long-running ones, is WebDriver Selenium. Really, really nice. There's a lot of support behind it. One of the big benefits is that it works in all browsers, so you can automate Safari, you can automate Internet Explorer. One of the downsides is that because they have this very noble goal of supporting all browsers, they basically limited themselves to like the smallest subset of features that those browsers are willing to implement. And that means that there are features missing that you might need. For instance, the latest spec, there's no way to access console logs. You don't have low-level access to like network requests. You can't like abort a network request. You can't pass like custom HTTP headers. Some of these things that you may want to do just aren't there. So that's something to weigh into your decision making. Puppeteer, really, really nice. Modern JavaScript interface, async and await, but it's Chrome only. I think there's some work being done on Firefox, but you gain a lot of this functionality, but then you're limiting yourself to Chrome. So that's a question to ask, you know, and discuss with your team, you know, what are we prioritizing here? Like lots of browsers or lots of features with one browser. Slimer.js, I mentioned, that's a Firefox only one. Lots of features in that too. Doesn't see a lot of updates these days, so that's something to factor in with some of these tools. Like, are they actively being worked on? Lots of other stuff. Cypress is a newish one that's really nice. They have kind of their own API. Also Chrome only right now. I think they're working on Firefox as well. There are services like us. Like I said, we're kind of codeless managed. And that comes with its own set of trade-offs. Like you save yourself some of that pain of the setup process, and you can have, you know, junior QAs in there having an easier time. But you know, the tests are running on our servers. You're limited to the features we give you. So just when you're choosing automation tools, just understand your requirements and think about, you know, what browsers do I want to automate? Who's going to be maintaining these tests? You know, is it a high-level engineer who's in there in the code, committing and managing? Or is it like a junior QA who maybe isn't a competent coder and needs like a solution that's a little more approachable? So all those things can factor into this decision. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about testing at scale, testing in parallel. So what I just covered, you know, traditional testing, previously pretty heavy, pretty expensive. Now it's with headless stuff, it can be a lot lighter. You can use Docker. You can run some of your tests in Lambda, Fargate. So you can scale up really quickly. And you find yourself in this situation now where you may have the ability to run 50 tests at a time in parallel instead of one, which can net you like huge speed benefits, right? If you've got 50 tests and they all take a minute and you run them all, that's 1 minute. If you run them one by one, that's 50 minutes. So that's like a huge difference. But when you're moving to that kind of setup, there's a real shift in your test design that needs to happen in order to do that. And that change, this is my obligatory meme, that change really revolves around state. And what I mean by state is the data that your test is going to create or manipulate or need to run. How is that data going to get there? Are these tests conflicting when they all touch the same data? Like, how does that all get set up? That becomes a big challenge when you're testing in parallel. And there's no magical solution I can give you to that problem, but I'll try to give you just some thoughts and best practices and things I've seen that I think work well. The first is just simple independent tests. Write really simple tests like log in, does the dashboard load, log out, done. So try to simplify your operations as much as you can, focus on one thing. And by doing that, you mitigate some of those issues of complexity that come up. Try to avoid state conflicts and race conditions. So you want to avoid two tests running in parallel that are manipulating the same record or the same user account. You want to avoid situations where one test signs into an account that's created by a different test, and you just hope that they're going to happen in time. So try to avoid these dependencies. Consider setting up and throwing away data. So this is a route you probably have to go down, or this is one of the more common routes people go down. And there's kind of two ways I've seen for doing this. The first is, you've got like a staging server and it's set up with the data that you need. So it has an account you're going to log into. It has some of the records you're going to manipulate. And that's all there. And it's a persistent thing. So it might be like staging.yourapp.com. And your tests log into that and they do their thing. And it stays there. So maybe you create some accounts that get left and thrown away. You have a sandbox login that logs in and does this, and so on and so forth. The other option I've seen is kind of like a setup script. So you have a temporary environment. You have maybe a container. It launches your application, and a setup script runs that populates the data. So it's like creates the user accounts, creates whatever records you're going to interact with. It stages all that data for you. Then your tests run, and that data is already set up for them. So if an order is going to be processed in your test or so on and so forth, it's already there. Where this helps is when you move from that situation of sequential to parallel, the data is there. So I'll give you another example to try to kind of bring home this setup. Imagine that you've got a sequential test right now, this long Selenium test, and it opens up your app, creates an account, then it logs out, then it logs into that account, updates the profile, then it logs out, then it logs in, then it adds some of your shopping cart, then it checks out, then it logs out, then maybe like an admin account logs in and processes that order. You've got all these features you're testing, but they're all dependent on the previous thing happening. You can't log into an account that wasn't created, you can't process the order that wasn't placed. And so this is how you need to think about, how am I going to put all that data there so that my account can log in, or my test can log in, the account is there. It can add this item in my shopping cart because the product is there. The admin account can process order because the order is there. So you have to think about how you're going to lay out this data. The last point I'll make is that sometimes dependencies are required. So you may have a situation where there's just no getting around the fact that these things have to happen sequentially. But in that situation, I'd recommend separating out those tests that can be parallel. So you've got all these tests that are simple. They don't need any outside data. They don't need any set of things to happen. Run those in parallel. Then you've got your long sequential ones that you can kind of separate out and let those run separately. So why is parallel testing worth it? Now that I've made it sound really horrible and challenging to set up the data, it's really not that bad. You have to think ahead of time about what data do I need? How am I going to get it there? And it's not a super challenging problem. You just have to put some thought into it. So why should you do this? I mean, the first is scale. If you've got 30 tests, you've got lots of engineers running the tests, you've got all these situations where they run, maybe anytime you merge or push changes, maybe anytime you save locally, anytime you deploy. You want that to be really efficient. You don't want engineers sitting there for 30 minutes while tests run. And so if you're going to really develop a really wide testing strategy and cover a lot with these tests, you're going to need to take this approach. Speed, kind of the same thing here. You want these tests running in parallel so that you can rip through them quickly and figure out, was everything working, was it not, and move on. Independent debugging, a huge benefit of this approach of keeping your tests completely self-contained is that you don't have to worry about these outside factors of, did something happen in this previous test that caused this test to fail? Did these tests conflict? You know that there are no outside factors. So it's very clear when something fails, what failed. And if you need to get yourself back there and troubleshoot that issue yourself manually, it's pretty obvious what I need to do. I can just follow these steps, and I don't need all this outside stuff from previous tests that have run to be there. And overall, that makes your test less brittle. It just cuts down on these outside dependencies. And that's a goal we're all chasing, right? Less brittle tests. Okay, but also, don't forget this. This is the test pyramid. I'm still a pretty big fan of this. Your proportions may kind of change based on what you're doing. The angles may change. Everybody's got different strategies. But at the end of the day, despite headless testing, despite all the new stuff that's out there and AI and self-healing tests and so on and so forth, end-to-end tests, testing in a browser is still by far the most costly type of testing you're going to do. And it's costly not just in the resources that you're spending, like the servers that are running the tests. It's costly because your tests have a huge amount of exposure to the most dynamic part of your application, which is the UI. And the UI is going to continually change, and your tests are going to require maintenance no matter what. So be really smart about what you're testing. You don't need to test everything just because headless browsers are there and fast. There are things that shouldn't be tested in this way, and there are better ways to test them, simpler ways. Okay, so I want to give you guys just a quick demo of our Ghost Inspector product, and specifically, I want to show you our suite of tests that we use to test our service. So we actually use our service to test our app. So I'll flip tabs over here. This is our Ghost Inspector app. Just log into a dashboard. So we've got this hosted, testing service. These are some of the suites we've got for various different things. Just kind of a bird's eye view of things passing and failing and so on. I want to show you this application suite, which is the one we use in just a minute. But I'll give you just kind of an overview of how you go about building some of the tests with our service. We have this idea of suites, which is basically just a grouping of your tests. So I'll go ahead and create a demo suite. And I can use our app here to create a new test, and I can start actually building this in our application. But we've got a pretty nice recording tool that's available in Chrome and Firefox. It's going to let me record a test and kind of jump off from there. So I'm going to change tabs again. There's a language learning startup that a friend of mine runs. It's called Voxy. We'll just pretend for a minute that I'm a QA at Voxy, and I want to create a really simple onboarding test. So what we do is open the extension. I've already logged in and I've connected this to my Ghost Inspector account. I'll create a new test. This is kind of like a Selenium IDE kind of deal if you're familiar with something like that. So for this test, we'll go solutions, go for individuals, come down to student sign up. Get this kind of onboarding flow here. Say, let's go. What's my proficiency? What do I want to accomplish? I want to travel abroad. What am I interested in? Technology, next. And I could keep going here and fill out this form and use like a random email or something. But I'll just stop. I'm going to make some assertions. So we have this assertion mode. An assertion would be checking the page to make sure some condition is true. I've carried out this action, and I want to make sure that the things I expect to show up are actually showing up. So I'll switch to that, and I get kind of a crosshair. These were the selections I made, so I'll click on travel, click on technology, I'll come back up, and then I'll just say I'm finished recording here. We'll give this test a name. Voxy onboarding, we'll put it in our demo suite. We do some screenshot comparison stuff, initial test run, and I'll hit save. So the way this recorder works is when you turn it on, it'll essentially start capturing the actions you're carrying out, right? Clicking, assigning things, and so on. The assertions, it captures those. It packages those steps up into a test, and then it sends it off to my Ghost Inspector account. So I get a view your test link here. And when it gets to Ghost Inspector, what Ghost Inspector does is it fires up a browser with those test steps. So here it's got some defaults, Firefox, screen resolution, and the Ghost Inspector service now has got a browser open and it's walking through those steps on our end. You can see it's come back here, so we get kind of a rundown of what was executed on the left, our steps. The record will grab CSS selectors, so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. Solutions for individuals link, level 4, next button, travel abroad, next button. These are really meant to just as a jumping off point. We don't really advocate a kind of like set it and forget it approach. It's more of like laying a framework for you to easily start building on top of. Down at the bottom, you've got the assertions for travel and technology. You get console output, you get a final screenshot. And then you get a full video of your test run as it's run on our server, and you see the actions being highlighted as they're carried out. You can create tests really easily like that. You can come in and edit the steps, and then you get this more robust editor where you can start to manage these selectors, carry out different types of actions. You can add conditionals. You can move things around, add comments, so on and so forth. And so you can come in here and customize this test, and you can start to modularize things. So kind of works in with parallel testing. If you've got something you're going to reuse over and over again, all your tests need to log in the beginning. You can start to break out your login steps and import these things where you need them. So you have your login steps in one place. Jump out of here. And so I've got my demo suite that I created in the beginning, and I've got this test, and I can go about fleshing out my tests here. We'll go back to the dashboard though. I want to show you this application suite. And this is what we use to test our application. So this opens browsers that run and test exactly what you're seeing, the application. And let's see, we've got about 10 tests in here. And when I hit run, like what our system does, it just triggers these all, like right away. It doesn't matter how many tests you have in your suite. You can throttle them if you need to, and you can make adjustments and do them sequentially. But it just launches them all. And we have them designed in a way where they're self-contained. They're not going to conflict. So here's like a simple example. This check dashboard test, imports the login steps, logs in, checks that the dashboard is loading, and logs out. So pretty simple test. And if I look at the steps, you can see it's really simple from this point of view. It's just doing my login steps. It's checking the H1 for dashboard, making sure the suites load, and then it's leaving. So if I jump back out here, you can see it's still got 2 running, but it rips through these pretty quickly. The runtime's usually 1 to 2 minutes. And we take that first approach I mentioned with the staging server. So what we have is a staging server with some of this data staged. So when we deploy to staging, that process runs these tests on staging, then it gets deployed to production, and we run the tests on production. There's one test down here that's an example of one of those kind of longer situations. This is something that we actually only run on our test environment. This test gets skipped on prod because it places an order. But here's an example of it running on test. And so for this test, it creates a full-on account with our system, and you can see it uses this timestamp in the email address to create a new account that's time-based. So it's always different. Comes in here and goes to our checkout screen and starts to buy a small plan on our system, double checks some sales tax stuff, starts to fill in our Stripe testing credit card number here. I think it puts in a wrong expiration date to make sure that fails. And then eventually it places the order properly, and it checks to make sure that a new organization was created. So that's one of those examples of this long series of things we wanted to check in one go. But as for the rest of this stuff, it's all pretty simple, straightforward operations, and it lets us run this stuff, really, really quickly. We can add more tests, and we're not in a situation where we're worrying about each time we add a test, this is all going to take longer. If we could add 10 more tests and it's still going to take basically the length of the longest test. So that's what I wanted to show you guys with Ghost Inspector. And then I have kind of just a recap, just to recap some of this stuff. I mentioned headless options available in Chrome and Firefox, easy to use, really lightweight. You can probably use them with the APIs and tools. With those APIs and tools, keep in mind that as you're choosing tools, they all have trade-offs. Our service has trade-offs, Selenium has trade-offs. Understand your requirements. Pick the tools that make sense for your priorities. There are huge efficiency gains when you're running tests in parallel. But with that comes a shift in design. And how are you dealing with this state? And how do these tests have what they need to run properly? And then lastly, browser tests have significant maintenance costs. So test smart. Think about, is this a type of thing I need to test with a browser, or is there a smarter way to go about this and mitigate some of that maintenance cost of selectors and UI and all those challenges? That's everything I've got. Happy to answer questions. We brought some swag with us. So there are some travel mugs out where you came in. Feel free to grab one. If you're a Ghost Inspector user or customer, we have a free forever tier. If you want to sign up and poke around, we have some t-shirts that you're welcome to grab as well. So that's all I've got. Thank you guys very much. Happy to answer any questions, anything I talked about or anything I didn't. Yes, sir.
So security codes that are unique every time, they don't have a flag, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Institution. How do you handle that?
So there are two approaches. We have a couple of services that help facilitate those kinds of things. One, let me open up our docs here. One is we have an email service, and what you can do is use this email.ghostinspector.com domain. You can use any username you want, and the email gets sent to a service we host, and then it's essentially like public based on whatever username. You can randomize your username, of course, but your same browser test can say trigger that email. It can then navigate, fetch the code from email, navigate back, plug it in. The other thing, if you're dealing with like texting codes, things like that, it's a little bit trickier, but we do have an example. You can use Twilio. So you can set up like a Twilio account and the code gets text there. And then you can use like an async JavaScript step. So this one, you can see it like hits Twilio's API, parses a JSON, and then it kind of parses out that code. So you could also do that. It takes a little bit of effort, and it can depend like what the security restrictions are around what you're doing. But those are the two approaches that we have for dealing with that.
So in our case, I just grab it out of the log. It would be, I just would have to maybe pull up Swagger to create a local API that could be pointed to then in the code similar to Twilio.
Yeah,
if you trap everything, nothing goes outside of the DMZ. But
I see.
Basically, it just, if you can talk to that API, I could create one and it would talk to that one.
Yeah, I assume then like you've probably got your own tests written and stuff. So yeah, you'd need to find some way to get that sent locally or get the code sent to a service that you can access via an API or via your file system and pull it out and pull it in that way. If you're coding your own tests, you have more flexibility there because you could access something, in some log on your local file system or whatever it may be. Yeah, of course.
Do you have any metrics-based details in your platform?
We don't have a whole lot right now. We do capture like some timing things that happen around, your steps, timestamps, but we don't have that really low level like, let's see, this kind of dev toolsy breakout of things loading. Yeah, not yet. One of the challenges is that like that's the kind of stuff that's really challenging to get with Selenium. Puppeteer gives you some pretty nice tools for accessing that. So I hope at some point like we can be there and offer that, but no, we don't.
Yeah, I think just some basic, how long a request takes. Or not,
Yeah.
I mean, not the one request, like the whole page loading.
Yeah, for sure. There's like a few kind of ways you can get some of that data, but it's more like setting steps and checking. So it's not ideal for our product for performance-y type stuff right now. Yeah.
How does Ghost Inspector handle responsive design apps, right? Sort of web pages with different viewports.
Yeah. So we have options for we have a bunch of options in here that I didn't want to bore you guys with, but we do allow like mobile resolution. So for responsive design, it's great, right? Because it's just using media queries to look at the size of your window. So you could run your test with a smaller responsive size. Let's see. I think our website should. So iPhone 6 size. Let's see what the screenshot looks like. But yeah, it'll render the page in that size, assuming your site is responsive. If your site looks for like a custom user agent, like for mobile Chrome, we also have a way to deal with that. But yeah, we do support different resolutions, and we'll also keep a baseline screenshot in the different resolutions. So our screenshot comparison is kind of like, you've probably seen some pretty complex stuff if you've seen like Applitools or Percy. But we do something kind of like this, where we keep a baseline of what your screenshot is supposed to look like, and if it changes and there's a certain percentage of change, it'll alert you. So you get these separate baselines for all those mobile screenshots, which is nice. Let's see. So yeah, we got the mobile screenshot here in the smaller resolution.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. For your screenshot comparisons, is it just pixel by pixel comparison?
It is, yeah. So we have a few features around it. So things like you can kind of tinker with the amount of threshold you're willing to accept. You can also, this one's pretty handy, like if you have, let's say you have like ads or some kind of like, advertising iframe, like you can specify these CSS selectors, and those will be like, the visibility will be set to hidden. So they get pulled out before that comparison is done. So you can avoid some of that stuff. There's some really cool stuff on the market. Applitools and Percy, they both like kind of focus on that, and they have some really fancy stuff. But this helps with a nice extra level of visual checking. There's also some packages out there under the hood. There's a package called Image Magic. If you have your own test and you just want to do some simple comparison on your own, that has some really simple commands for just passing two images and diffing them. And so if that's something you want to explore with your own coded tests, Image Magic's a pretty cool library for doing that stuff. Anybody have anything else? Doesn't have to be about Ghost Inspector specifically.
One thing I noticed with on the Foxy site was when we went into one of them, the CSS or JavaScript, whatever, changed it was like popping up different things on the screen. That's going to be like incredibly difficult. I mean, like it's just incredibly difficult to test that functionality is actually working. There's a lot of those. It was like on step 2 or whatever. I don't know if you noticed, but like each one of the options kind of popped out and changed colors.
Oh, was it on my screen too when I was doing it?
Yeah. But anyway, it's not. I mean, that's hard to do with literally anything. Like headless or not headless, and only really visual regression can kind of do that, because I don't know how you do that and get your timing correct.
Oh, you mean do you mean like?
So like transitions, HTML5 transitions
of
like animations.
Yeah.
Hover over and that sort of thing.
That wasn't even a hover. That was just like a timed thing. Yeah. But yeah. Anyway, I was just making a comment about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think, if I'm understanding your point, one thing we do this automatically, and I think other packages are starting to do this, but we basically wait for any event, anything you're interacting with. So like if I'm looking for this to sign something here, like kind of traditional Selenium, it would like look for this element, and if it wasn't there, hadn't loaded yet, it would just fail. What we do is we always look for stuff. So your test will always just wait and sit there for the element it needs. And you have some options to control that. So how long does the test wait for an element? 30 seconds, and then if it's not there, then it fails. So some of those safeties are built in. for mouse over stuff, we don't record mouse over stuff, but we do have an action for it. So let me get back to the test we're actually talking about. I think for
One of
this,
these screenshots actually showed it.
oh,
Like halfway there. If you see like high, intermediate, and the other one was.
oh, yeah, you're saying like that, how they were kind of doing that ripple effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't really impact the test or the video. If you were like potentially capturing a screenshot here and comparing it, where was it? Like somewhere here.
Yeah.
Then yeah, when you're doing visual testing, that you've got to think about timing and loading, and so you could. I recommend putting some assertions in place to be like, make sure these things are in place, because then I know my screenshot's gonna be fully rendered and then take it. So I think we have a timing setting around that. It waits. Let's see. It'll wait 5 seconds by default, and you can extend that. But the best way to do it is really to create assertions that are going to ensure the specific scenario. Yeah, you want to capture.
So you don't have an assertion to say the page is done loading, all requests are in?
We don't right now, because it'll actually do that automatically between the steps. It'll check like, is the page loaded? Is the element I need there? Yes, proceed with the next step. Yeah.
Do you have any integrations, say with test case management tools to report that those have run or not?
We've got a lot of CI integrations. We were just talking yesterday about like Jira and TestRail, right, is another one. So most of our integrations are mostly around CI and running these tests, in your CI setup. So we don't have a whole lot around that layer of test management tools, but we do get requests for it. Something we like that's on our radar. Yeah.
Will you be able to automate Angular apps like?
Yeah. So our app itself is actually Angular. It's still Angular 1. But yeah, that's what is really nice with PhantomJS. It was pretty rough because it was this older version of WebKit, and it would have all kinds of problems with React and things. But now that you're automating with Chrome and Firefox proper, Angular, React. The one thing that's pretty hard to test with, we can't really do it right now, and I think it's kind of a challenge in the industry in general, is Shadow DOM. If you're familiar with that concept, it's kind of like putting components and they're not accessible through your normal like query selector, and that's pretty challenging. But yeah, React, Angular, Vue, it's all kind of agnostic to that browser that's there running it. Yeah.
Is there any revision around the test suites? Like, can we revision it with the code?
No, that's another thing we've talked about. So we do keep a running history. There's a pretty long history that you can go back and see the changes that were made and make adjustments. But yeah, a big initiative of ours is the ability to have like revisions to roll back, and then ultimately like some way to potentially like commit these to code and get a tighter integration that way. But for now, it is kind of its own service, and no, there's no easy way to roll back. Sure.
So back to responsive design, just with in Chrome, it wasn't visible on the screen trying to find it with Selenium. That's not even a conversation here, correct?
You like couldn't find the element?
Right, unless it was visible. So if it wasn't on the proper spot.
Yeah, gotcha.
You have to scroll down.
Yeah. So ours scrolls down automatically. Like there's a lot of really nice logic that I baked in from the beginning that I wanted, where I was like, why doesn't automation just do this automatically? Like the element should be there and you should scroll to it. So we scroll to it. I think some of the newer stuff will scroll to it. I imagine Puppeteer probably doesn't have that problem. With Selenium, I feel like a lot of times in between the steps, it's like I want to click something, but let me first make sure it's there, and then let me scroll to it, and so on. So you're kind of buffering all your steps with these safeties. So yeah, I don't know of an easy solution with Selenium other than potentially baking that in yourself, but I feel like that's something that's being worked on, and it's generally not a problem on our platform. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. Thank you to the Austin Automation Professionals for hosting us. Thank you again to Handsome. Let's see. put my Twitter back up there. Like, feel free to reach out to me anytime on Twitter if you have random, automation questions. We have a free forever tier that I mentioned. You can sign up and you can poke around and kind of see if this is something that makes sense to you or not. And like I said, travel mugs. If you want to sign up, see Renata over there, and she'll hook you up with a t-shirt.
Still tons of food too.
Oh, there's still tons of food too. Yeah, take a pizza.